O'Reilly! You've got questions? O'Reilly Auto Parts has answers. Need a pro you can trust? We've got that too. No matter what you need, our professional parts people have the training and expertise to help you do things right. Deep automotive knowledge, just one part that makes O'Reilly stand apart. The professional parts people. O'Reilly Auto Parts.
Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
I'm Wayne Callan, and you're listening to the second of 4 ADHD Awareness Month webinars. Today's webinar is about accepting, owning, and moving forward with your ADHD. Lots of us living with ADHD get stuck managing symptoms or are a victim of daily negative thinking that prevents us not only from tackling the challenges of life, but learning to like and love ourselves. Adults often ask us here at Attitude, is my goal to work hard at changing myself, to function like neurotypicals, or is it to fully understand my relationship with ADHD and to use the positive things of the disorder to live a happy, fulfilling life? Today, Emily Anhalt will give us strategies and approaches for achieving success in the workplace, at home, and in dealing with many strong emotions that can shut us down or send us off on a roller coaster ride. She's the right person to give us the clues to success. She studied adults with ADHD who found success and happiness and learned how to leverage the disorder as a positive force in their lives. Emily is a psychotherapist and psychological consultant practicing in San Francisco. If you haven't already watched it, I heartily recommend that you watch Emily's TED Talk on ADHD. It's called The Trouble with Normal, My ADHD, the Zebra. You can find the video on attitudemag.com. Just search Emily Anhalt video. So I now turn it over to Emily.
Hi, everyone. It is an honor to be here talking about how to foster a healthy relationship with your adult ADHD. So I'm going to start with a few words about my interest and background in this subject. I was diagnosed with ADHD when I was 7, and I was immediately put on medication. I hated how the meds made me feel, and I found creative ways not to take them. For example, throwing the pills out the window when my parents weren't looking. And my parents did eventually let me stop taking the meds. And I was really fortunate to have the support and resources available to me to figure out workarounds for many of my ADHD symptoms. And as I got older, I realized that some of my symptoms actually allowed me to do things that those without ADHD seem to have some trouble doing, like focusing on many things at once and switching my attention between tasks really easily. I eventually went on to graduate school to study clinical psychology, and I decided to do my doctoral dissertation on ADHD and success without the use of medication. So when I chose this topic for my research, I was hoping to hear the stories of adults with ADHD who had not only found ways to mitigate their negative ADHD symptoms, but who also felt that their ADHD had helped them achieve their success. I want to say my goal was not to prove that medication is not useful or helpful or effective. In fact, I believe that medication is useful and even necessary for some people with ADHD. But looking back on my own childhood experience, I wished that medication had not been the first course of action taken with me, and I wanted to hear from adults who had employed techniques other than medication successfully. In doing my literature review for the research, I also discovered that there was next to no empirically validated research exploring the positive aspects of ADHD, and I wanted to change that so that psychologists and physicians looking to learn more about ADHD would have this perspective available to them. So I interviewed adults with ADHD who had achieved financial and occupational success and who were not currently taking medication. And I asked them about their relationship to their ADHD and how it had affected their childhoods and their careers, their relationships, and anything else they thought would be helpful. And the stories they told me were validating and eye-opening and vulnerable and difficult and fantastic. I heard stories that rang true with my own experience, And I heard other stories that really challenged my beliefs about what ADHD can look like. I learned new techniques for dealing with some of the more frustrating aspects of ADHD, and I heard inspiring accounts of triumph over really difficult times. But perhaps the most profound conclusion that I came away with was this idea that the stigmas that people with ADHD face for learning differently and for being different are often more harmful to them than the actual ADHD symptoms. The most painful memories my participants recalled were those of feeling less than, of being singled out, of being or made fun of feeling shame and sadness, and of not understanding why this was all happening to them. So I took this idea and I turned it into a TEDx talk. I told my own story, and also I talked about the results of my dissertation. And my main objective there was to suggest that ADHD is difficult and frustrating, no doubt, but it can also be a superpower if harnessed correctly. I wanted to challenge the idea that ADHD is a disability and suggest that perhaps it's just a different way of being in the world with its own benefits and detriments like anything else. And that if our education system and society at large could shift its view of ADHD even just a bit, there would be room for more people to thrive. So I did this talk, and what followed from it was really inspiring. My email box was flooded with messages from adults with ADHD who were diagnosed in childhood, adults with ADHD who had just finally put a diagnosis to their symptoms. I got emails from parents of children with ADHD and from teachers who had kids with ADHD in their classes. And the overall feedback was essentially, yes, okay, if only people were more accepting of ADHD as a different way of being in the world, my experience of it would have been much less painful. But I also received requests from people all over the world saying, okay, so I've shifted the way I think about my ADHD, but now what? How do I use this information to be as successful as possible despite and because of my ADHD? So, using all of my own personal history and my research and my clinical experience, I developed what I am calling a 3-layered approach to confronting and making the most of your ADHD, which I'm going to dive into right now. So, the first layer of this approach is perhaps the most difficult. It asks you to confront an often covert and hidden, but really pervasive and painful truth of having ADHD, and that is that for your whole life, you have been different. You have been going through your life taking in information and learning and relating to others in a manner that is both consciously and unconsciously stigmatized and discouraged in our society. In one of the studies that I cite in my dissertation, a group of students were told that they would be interacting with a student with ADHD who did not actually have ADHD. And the results of the study showed that the expectation of ADHD alone was enough to result in less friendly interactions, as well as a decrease in conversation with these students. The students also judged the children labeled with ADHD as being more difficult and less skilled than children that they believed to be, quote, normal. So just the label of ADHD, separate from any behavior, elicits negative reactions. Also, because most schools and workplaces are not really set up to accommodate many different learning and work styles, there is an unconscious pressure put onto children to bend themselves and to conform to a certain way of being and learning, namely sitting still for hours on end and focusing intently. And when they can't do this, they're often reprimanded instead of being given tips and tricks and tools to make use of the way they do learn. Now, I'll say, for those of us who are really disruptive and impulsive and hyperactive, it does make sense that some of our behavior was not especially appreciated. But an important thing to understand about this is that ADHD is often accompanied by a kind of obliviousness. Kids, especially with ADHD, don't always understand the effect their behavior is having on others. So they sense that people dislike them or are frustrated with them, but they don't really get why. So to make sense of these negative reactions they're constantly getting, which can be overt or subtle, they often believe that there is something wrong with them or that they are inherently bad in some way. And this, understandably, leads to feelings of shame and loneliness, of anger and anxiety, of feelings of being less than or not enough. So, as I mentioned in my research, it was this aspect of ADHD that people related to the most painfully. That feeling of being less than seeps out way beyond the ADHD itself and becomes part of how one sees themselves in the world. Many people with ADHD are never diagnosed also, so they go through huge portions of their life feeling these negative reactions, but having no idea why. How do we confront our ADHD on this first level? First and foremost, just understanding the role this stigma and these feelings of shame have played in your life is really important. In order to change that negative self-talk about being less than or stupid or bad or any number of other things that people with ADHD often feel deep down, you first have to recognize it and understand it better. So that brings us to step 1 of layer 1. I believe that the best way to do this, if it's at all available and possible for you, is to get into psychotherapy. Therapy provides an objective space for you to think through how your experiences with feeling different and othered have influenced your relationship with yourself and others in the world. It also gives you an empathetic and understanding and knowledgeable person with whom to work through some of this stuff. And with time, it will get easier to remind yourself that you are enough and you're just doing your best, and that you were just a kid trying to figure things out. And you have resources available to you now as an adult that you might not have had available to you as a kid that are going to help you thrive. We really do have to be gentle and loving toward ourselves, and the ability to do that is a skill, and we have to learn and practice it. Therapy is a really great place to do that. The next step in this layer is to educate yourself as much as possible about ADHD itself. The more you understand about ADHD, the easier it's going to be to put a little bit of space between it and you. And by that, what I mean is that ADHD is a part of who you are. It is a part of your identity, but it's not all you are. Learning about how ADHD actually works was really empowering for me because it helped me realize that there were actual things happening in my brain. Like, wow, I'm not bad or stupid. I just don't produce as much dopamine as the average gal, and there are things I can do to work with that imbalance. That you're listening to this webinar means you're already educating yourself, so I'm really glad you're here. The final step of this layer is super important, and that is find your community. I can't stress enough what a big difference it makes to feel like you're part of a tribe, especially if you've spent a lot of your life feeling like an other. Get out there and talk to people who have had the same struggles as you. Join online ADHD communities like this one. Comment on blog posts about ADHD with your own experience. Surround yourself with people who get it. And this can be people who get it because they have ADHD. It can be people who get it because they've also felt different for any number of reasons. Or it can be people who get it because they've learned about it from you and they really love you exactly the way you are. The second layer of this 3-layered approach is about mitigating the negative or difficult symptoms of your ADHD. Because although ADHD can be a superpower, it can also be hugely frustrating and difficult to manage. So the first step of this layer is to explore and learn as much about your own unique relationship with ADHD as possible. So in layer 1, you learned about ADHD itself. In layer 2, you're learning about what ADHD looks like for you. Some of that is going to be done in the therapy, but a lot of it has to do with just making note of when your ADHD is a problem in your life. Like, is it worst at work? Does it hold you back the most because you forget important meetings? Does it come out the most when you're stressed or lonely or hungry or bored? Are there certain places or environments where it's more difficult to focus? Or maybe, does it seem to not be a big problem when you're with your friends, but when you're at home with your partner and your guard is down, it comes out then? These are all just possible examples. The idea is just to tune into it as much as you can. And once you have a sense of what your ADHD looks like for you, and remember it's different from person to person, you can start to accept it for what it is and tackle the issues one by one. Which brings us to step 2 in this layer, implement techniques and workarounds. Now this is where I got a lot of great ideas from the interviews I did, For example, one interviewee told me that it took her years to accept the fact that she should never put her keys anywhere but a designated key spot. It sounds like a little thing, but for those of us who have spent cumulative weeks of our lives looking for our keys, this is a big one. And this was a particular problem for her. It was causing her real issues. And when she realized that putting something down and then forgetting where she put it is a bigger problem for her than it is for most people, she put a bowl next to her door and she promised herself and trained herself never to put her keys down anywhere but there. So if you tend to forget important appointments a lot, for example, train yourself to keep a calendar with alarms that remind you about appointments and meetings. I actually have alarms set to remind me to set alarms. That's how much I rely on them. If you're a fidgeter, keep a little toy or silly putty in your bag or in your desk at work so that you have something to do with your hands. My biggest issue, like many people with ADHD, is that it's really tough for me to focus on something that I don't find interesting. I'm sure many of you can relate to that. So at some point, I think in high school, I did a little test. I started timing myself to see how long I could pay attention to a boring task before my mind wandered. I did a few trials over the course of a few weeks, and I realized that my brain can focus on an uninteresting task for about 10 minutes. So from then on, I never expected myself to focus on something boring for more than 10 minutes without a little boost. So now when I'm working on something tedious, every 10 minutes, or every time my mind wanders, I'll take a little bite of a snack, or I'll surf the web for a minute, or I'll stretch, just to give myself that little dopamine boost that allows me to dive back into the task. So these are just a few examples of workarounds. Really, I just want to empower you to figure out what's not working for you and to see if there are systems you can set up in your life to make things a little better. If you're having trouble doing this for yourself, think about working with an ADHD coach who can help you think of ways to mitigate these issues and can hold you accountable. And then finally, for this step, I very highly recommend getting into meditation, yoga, and establishing a healthy exercise routine. These are 3 things that have been proven through research and experience to really mitigate the negative symptoms of ADHD. And I myself have found them to be really successful for any number of reasons. So if you can find a way to get into that, I really recommend it. That brings us to the 3rd step of this layer, which is to educate those around you. Teach your friends, family, partner, and boss about how your ADHD affects you so that they'll have more context for it and so that they can support you in mitigating the negative symptoms. This, of course, is going to look different from person to person. But for example, talk with your partner about your ADHD so that when, halfway through a conversation, you completely change topics without notice, they won't take it personally because they understand that this is something that can happen. If doodling during meetings helps you focus better, teach your boss about ADHD and explain why doodling helps you so that he or she doesn't think you're not paying attention while you're drawing. Fill in your friends about your struggles so that when you blurt out a random thought while your friend is telling you an important story, you can say, "My ADHD got the best of me for a second. Please finish your story. It's important to me." And they'll have some context to understand that. Because when people understand things, it is much easier for them to empathize with them and to make space for them. I'll give you an example. One of my interviewees told me that for years, her husband would get so frustrated with her when he would ask her to help with a task and then find her an hour later working on something different, like a craft project, for example, or organizing all of the books on their shelf by color. He felt really offended, like it was her saying, "Your task isn't as important to me as the things I feel like doing." And they got in a lot of fights. It caused a lot of issues. She didn't really have the language to explain what was going on. Of course, that wasn't her intention. She told me, I'd get distracted by something on the way to completing the task, and it's like the original thing I was supposed to be doing completely disappeared. But after she learned more about how ADHD works, and she shared the info with her husband, and she explained that she doesn't even realize she's forgotten about the original task until it's too late, and it really has nothing to do with not caring about his needs. He started to feel less angry about it, and he began giving her gentle reminders about things. Finally, the 3rd layer of this 3-layered approach is about setting yourself up to make the best use of your positive ADHD symptoms. Because, and I really do believe this, ADHD can be a superpower in addition to being a frustration. People with ADHD are fantastic at things like brainstorming because their mind can jump all around and put unusual thoughts together. I've found that a lot of people with ADHD are really good at making puns because they can think of a lot of different aspects of words at the same time and squish them together in unique ways. Mm-hmm. People with ADHD can often do 2 or 3 things at once and actually focus on all 3 of them better than if they were only doing one thing, because having more stuff going on at the same time raises those levels of internal stimulation and makes it easier to focus. Many of my interviewees, and I felt this too, described the kind of hyper-focus that they're able to achieve under the right conditions, where they can accomplish huge amounts of work in way less time than would be expected. The thing that I found, though, for most people with ADHD is that in order to make use of this superpower, conditions have to be just right. So that's going to bring us to the first step of this layer, which is explore your own positive symptoms. If you've found that you're able to hyperfocus, think about when and why and how it happens. For example, there is little to no chance of me achieving hyperfocus if I'm hungry. I know that about myself now. Do you concentrate better when you're doing a few things at the same time? What are those things? If one of the things is way more interesting than the other, are you likely to only concentrate on that one? Really get to know the mechanism in your own mind and what it looks like and how it feels. Maybe you're really good at tasks and games that require you to be thinking about many things at once. That's a good thing to know about yourself. So that takes us to the second step, which is to accommodate yourself. Once you've spent some time just thinking about and making note of these things, you're going to be able to make the changes necessary to set yourself up to make use of them and to be successful with them. So if you've discovered that you work best with music on, make sure that your work or homework area is set up for music. I personally do my work best if I'm physically comfortable, so I never try to do my work at the table in an uncomfortable chair. And I found this to be a real interesting self-fulfilling prophecy where I used to try to force myself to do work in a library where it was really quiet and the chairs were uncomfortable. And I just could not focus. And I developed such negative self-talk about how unable I am to get work done and how terrible I am at this. And it just made it harder to work, of course, because I felt like such a failure. And when I realized that when I'm more comfortable, I'm easier to focus because my mind isn't jumping to my physical state versus what I'm focusing on, things really changed. And so now I don't even try to work at an uncomfortable chair because I know it's not going to happen, and I'd rather set myself up for success. So I make sure to set myself up in situations where I'm going to be able to sit in a comfortable chair with a snack and get to work. One of my interviewees that I spoke with makes it a stipulation of hiring her at any job that she be given an assistant, because she has come to understand about herself that she's going to do her best work if someone is keeping her on task and is taking care of certain things for her that are not her strengths, allowing her the time and space to do the things that are her strengths. Of course, I know that these things aren't always possible. Not everyone has the resources to demand an assistant, but the more you know about what allows for your best functioning, the easier it's going to be to achieve that level of functioning. So with that, the final step in layer 3 is don't be afraid to ask for accommodations from those around you. If you're in the position to do so, look for a job at a company that allows for different work styles. Ask your boss if you can do your work outside. Ask your teacher if they would mind if you folded origami during their lecture, for example. My experience has been that if you can ask for what you need, if you can put words to it, if you can explain why it's helpful for you, and if you can prove that you will get your work done, people are very willing to accommodate you. Now more than ever, schools and workspaces are tuning into the idea that not everyone does things the same way, and that it's going to have the biggest benefit all around if people are able to do things the way that they've found to work best for them. So I just want to quickly review the 3 layers. Layer 1 is about confronting and processing through the emotional toll that being different can have on your mental health and well-being. Layer 2 is about understanding how you're held back by your ADHD and mitigating these issues as best as you can. I should add in that there's also a piece about forgiving yourself for the things that you can't totally control. It's important we give ourselves a break, and no one's perfect. And layer 3 is about setting yourself up to make use of your unique gift and superpower. So before we dive into questions, I just wanted to let everyone know that I understand the struggle and I want to make myself as available as possible to this community. Find me on Twitter. My handle is at EmilyCA5, or reach out by email. I reply to as many as I can. My email address is EmilyAnhaltPsyd, that's PSYD, @gmail.com. Thank you so much, and I'm really excited to hear your questions.
Well, I'll start it off I have a question about the psychotherapy aspect in layer 1. Are you talking about talk therapy? Are you talking about cognitive behavioral therapy? I just wanted you to expand on that a little.
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that. I get a lot of questions about what kind of therapy and how do you know when you have the right therapist. There's plenty to be said there, but I'll start by saying when it comes to layer 1 specifically, I personally recommend a psychodynamic or psychoanalytic style of therapy. And that's because the goal of that therapy is really to get down to the deep layers of the way your experiences have set you up in the world. They're not going to be sitting right there helping you come up with exactly how to fix your symptoms. It's really going to be more focused on how has being this way in the world affected you and your relationships. How can we change some of the messages you've been telling yourself for so long? How has this protected you in the past, and is it still protecting you, or is there maybe room to change it? These are the things that are going to be more focused on, and I think they're really beneficial. And then in addition to that, you could also be doing a cognitive behavioral therapy or a ADHD coaching to tackle the more here and now problems. So I can understand how if it's hard for you to hold down a job because your executive functioning is so impaired, maybe your first priority is just getting some of those symptoms into check so that you can function, and then you can think a little more about the other stuff. But it really has made a huge difference in my experience and from many people I've spoken to get to the heart of it and to just honor what it's been like to go through your life feeling all of these things coming from people and knowing that something wasn't quite right, but not understanding what. Childhood is what we build so much of our thought patterns on. And to have a chance to look at those and to change the ones that aren't working anymore can be really powerful. So I would say, for my personal recommendation, to try to find a psychodynamic or psychoanalytic psychotherapy to get into.
Mm-hmm. Betty has asked, is it wise to let a new employer know that you have ADHD?
That's such an interesting question because I wish I could say that there wasn't still such a stigma on it and that people won't be treated differently for such things, but that's just not true. The study that I mentioned about how people will change what they think you're capable of just from the label without any correlating behavior it's a frustrating one. So my advice would be to feel it out. If you have a boss who seems to really appreciate that every employee is unique and has something to contribute and seems to be willing to accommodate, then yeah, I think it might be a good idea to feel it out, especially if you can follow it with information and education about what having ADHD means for you, what it means for you in the workplace, and how you can best accommodate it. I think there are a lot of employers out there who are really open to that. But if you're in a place where everyone's expected to be the same and it feels like it's only going to draw more stigma to you, then unfortunately it's just not always a safe place to be totally transparent. And instead I'd try to just ask for the workarounds that you can within the privacy of your own mind, knowing what they're for.
A couple of people have asked, how can I change the people around me, namely friends and relatives, so that they get my ADHD the way I do? This person says things won't get better in my life until their perspective changes. It is hard work to change people's minds. So I guess they're asking what kind of conversations can you have with friends and relatives that would educate them and not offend them and yet still bring them on board with the ADHD?
Yeah, definitely. Well, firstly, I want to put out there that it has been my experience that there are still a lot of people out there who don't really believe ADHD is even a thing. They think, oh, well, if you can focus on video games but not your work, sorry, that doesn't make sense to me. Or, I have trouble focusing too, so, do I have ADHD? And I'm seeming to be doing just fine. There's all kinds of people out there who just don't totally get it. I think the change starts within you, that you really have to embody the knowledge that if something is affecting you, then that's what's important about it. Ultimately, we want the validation of people around us to understand our experience. But if you can really live from a place of knowing that you're going through something different and that you have to interact with the world a little differently, you're going to start to live that truth, and it's going to expand from there. Also, I hope that people have people in their lives that are willing to sit down and listen. And that is why educate those around you feels like such an important step. Really think about what helped me understand ADHD. So, for example, for me, it really started to click when I learned about the mechanism of dopamine and stimulation and how that relates to how doing more things at once helps all of them be more easy to focus on, things like that. That really resonated with me. And there were people in my life who are also going to relate to that particular kind of explanation. And then there are going to be people who don't care to know much about dopamine, and they'd rather just understand through examples of when things work for you and when they don't. I've also found that if you can put words to how someone can best support you, they're going to be more likely to do it. So if you can say, this is what I need from you in this situation. I find myself with this particular struggle, and if you were able to help me in this particular way, I think it'd make a really big difference. So, for example, I've used this example before, but I tend to leave drawers and cabinets open when I leave a room. And my partner used to get really frustrated about it, and his frustration felt so bad that it was hard for me to connect it to something that seemed a little out of my control, and it just felt like frustration with me. And I was able at some point to sit him down and say, I totally get why it's frustrating you that I do this, but I really don't realize I'm doing it. So from now on, maybe when it happens, you can just lead me by the hand back into the room and we'll close them together. And hopefully over time, I'll start to make notice of it in a different way. And I think just seeing the relationship I have to this particular thing that I do, seeing that it's really not personal, that it's not an assault on our home or anything like that, just changed the whole vibe, just changed the feeling. And now when I do it, we laugh because we've realized, oh, you and your ADHD, here it is again. And so I think having the conversations, being willing to own that these things do affect the people in our lives negatively sometimes, but ultimately hoping that they can have the empathy and understanding to stick with you through it can go a really long way.
Mm-hmm. You referenced talking about being part of an ADHD community. Several people have asked, is it worth trying to make friends with non-ADHD people? It's gone that far. They feel most comfortable being around support groups and friends and spending time with friends who have ADHD. So I guess the question is, I guess the answer is yes, you should be friends with both non-ADHD and ADHD people, but it's so much easier to, in a lot of cases, to just, hang out with people with the diagnosis. What do you think? How do you?
Yeah, well, I commend people for finding their community. And like I said, I do think it's really important to have friends who have it because they understand it in a new way. I also think that there are particular people that you might position in your life in certain ways. Like one of my interviewees said that he will only work with someone, like in a direct partnership kind of way, who has ADHD because he's found that they're just able to discuss things in certain ways. So he's just found that works for him. And so to be most successful in his work, that's what he does. But I have found, at least in my own life, that I really benefit from having people who think and do things a different way. I think that probably only works if those people are willing to accept you the way you are. I can't really imagine being friends with people who don't have ADHD and who don't think it's a thing and who are sick of all of the ways that it manifests in your life. I can't imagine how that's going to be very conducive to your success. But there are people in my life who don't have it, but find it very endearing in me when they do see it come out because it's such a unique thing and so recognizable. I talk about it so much that I'll do something and they'll say, oh, there it is again. So my experience is that find people in your life with and without ADHD who are just willing to accept you and who are willing to grow with you and who are willing to listen to what your experience is like and how it affects you. If you can do that, then that's a pretty great lot in life.
Right, for sure. People are asking, what is a simple way or a book or a website or something that would explain ADHD very simply and straightforwardly if they want to share it with people they know or relatives, friends? Can you recommend anything? Or you can think about it and perhaps get back to us and we can share it with our group. But didn't know if anything off the top of your head, if you had anything off the top of your head for that.
The first thing that came to mind was attitude, because it's crowdsourced and it's a community engagement place where hundreds of different perspectives on any one particular aspect of ADHD have been expressed and written about. So you can find the one that really resonates best for you, right? So, there are plenty of articles and books that explain ADHD from one perspective, but is that the one that really resonates with you? And is that the one you think the people in your life are going to understand the best? I don't know. So I think ADHD blogs are really helpful for that, because you can kind of search through and find the one that clicks in your mind and then share with the people that you think it would best explain things for. That being said, I'll definitely think on if there are any particular books. I was recently on a podcast called Faster Than Normal with Peter Shankman, and I had a lot of fun with that because he brings on a different guest every week, and they all are doing totally different things in their life. But the shared thread is that they're all doing something awesome, and they feel like they're partially doing it because of their ADHD. So I felt like that was really empowering for that perspective. So I would tune into that.
So that's Peter Shankman, Faster Than Normal, you said?
Yeah.
Okay. This is a woman who's an administrative assistant, and she says she has a boss who's neurotypical to the nth degree. She likes the work. She works in an accounting firm, but everything has to be done in a set way, or else I am not doing a good job in his eyes. I have to support my family, so I can't just leave the job in a huff. So she's asking what she can do to sort of broaden the parameters or broaden his mindset about work, other than leaving. It's a tough one.
Well, firstly, I just want to really validate how tough that would be. I really did find through my research that people with ADHD have a much more difficult time getting stuff done if they have to do it according to someone else's way. That one of the best ways people with ADHD can be successful is by being given the space to do it how they do it. So, for example, a lot of people with ADHD are procrastinators because the anxiety of being close to a deadline kind of acts like a stimulant, right? It kind of kicks you into gear. So if you're at a job where people need you to do things way in advance just because that's what they're comfortable with, it's going to be really tough. That's not in line with what you do. So I guess I would optimistically suggest that you sit down with your boss and explain not only that your mind works a little differently, but how it works, and how you might do things differently than the way he wants you to do them. And then maybe say, can we give this a try? Can I show you that I'll still get the work done? And then we can reassess together. I want to show you that I can do things my way and still meet your needs. And hope that he has the willingness at least to make some space for it. If he doesn't, then I think your best bet is to continue working as best as you can to quietly seek opportunities for places that are going to let you thrive in your own way. Because, we can drink coffee and we can meditate and we can do all kinds of things, but when it comes down to it, sometimes we just function differently in the world. And if no one's willing to bend to that, it's going to be really tough.
All right. Several people are saying, or asking, should we look for a therapist who, specializes in ADHD or at least has a base knowledge of it? I would think yes, but they also mention that those type of people or therapists are hard to find. So any recommendations on that?
I can imagine finding a therapist who specializes in ADHD might be helpful, but the type of therapy that I was suggesting doesn't have as much to do with the ADHD itself as it does with the effects of having had it on your psyche, on your actual relationship to yourself and others. And I think that's something that any therapist is going to have experience with. I think it's more important than anything to find a therapist with whom you're really comfortable and you feel that there's a good fit and who's open to not only hearing about your experience, but also working through the tougher aspects of things with you. And if you can find that, then what's going to happen is you're going to develop a relationship with them that's going to allow them to be an expert on your ADHD. And you're going to have a chance to explore with them what it's really meant for you, what it's looked like for you. And, I think someone who has no understanding of ADHD at all could really benefit from an expert filling them in. But I think beyond that, what's even more helpful is someone who's willing to be there with you while you figure out what it's looked like for you. And no ADHD expert is going to be able to tell you exactly what it's looked like in your life. So I'd say my number one recommendation is to find someone who feels like a good fit. And if it happens to be someone who has experience working with ADHD, that's a great bonus.
That's good advice, yes. Meg has a question. She says, my husband always finds fault and places blame on me. Handling my occasional missteps with humor would help me, along with a pat on the back for all the things I do right. I feel so much shame when he heaps the blame on me. I want to talk with him about this and how he makes me feel, but what should I say?
What a big question, and good for you for wanting to talk to him about it. I would say carve out an actual time. Set up the stage so that he knows that this is something that's important and close to you. Sit down with him and say, I've been thinking a lot about the way certain aspects of my behavior and personality have affected you and have affected us. And I wonder if we can start a dialogue together to figure out how to look at them and deal with them a little bit differently. I really care about what you think and how I affect you. And so I want to be as transparent as I can with you about what I think is going on. And I want to enlist you as much as possible to support me as I figure these things through. Is that something that you'd be open to? And then, have on hand the behaviors that you know are frustrating and help him understand why they happen, how much control you feel you ultimately have over them, what you do or don't feel that is possible to do to mitigate or change them, and how you feel he could best support you when things go right and when things go wrong. And hopefully with time, a conversation's one thing, and then the next time it happens, let's say you forget something important and he gets really mad, and you can say, remember that conversation we had a few months ago? I think this is happening right in this moment. I think I've just forgotten something important, and it was really frustrating to you. And I want to point out that in this moment, it wasn't that I forgot it because it wasn't important. It was that I forgot it because my mind jumped to something shiny or something that grabbed my attention. And I can imagine it didn't feel very good for you, but can you see where I'm coming from here? And you call it out as it goes. You tag it and make it feel a little more recognizable. And I hope that your husband will be able to see that and to give you the empathy that you deserve. And, sometimes we have to own things and realize that they are frustrating in order to be able to help people change their attitude about it a little bit.
I would imagine in relationships like this where ADHD, non-ADHD spouses, humor is very helpful. It sounded like you sort of referenced that in your relationship with your partner. But I don't know how you bring that to the fore if a person is not receptive to humor. So, but
right.
Can the ADHD person sort of see? Go ahead, sorry.
No, that's okay. I think if you can bring humor to it yourself, that's the best way. Sometimes I'll do something and I'll just laugh at myself. I'll be like, well, there I go again. I'm so sorry. Here I am with my ADHD brain. And hopefully then people will know that it's okay to laugh with you. And that, it's not such a heavy and serious thing if you can move on from it.
Lee has asked, I was diagnosed 5 years ago at age 44. My son is 12 and has ADHD. What is a good way to show him ADHD is not a disability, but can be a superpower as well? So this is sort of role modeling somehow, or saying the right words. So anyway, I turn it over to you.
I'm so glad that there's an awareness of the ways in which we can help our kids with these things. So I wrote a blog post about this for attitude, and I think it ended up being called Lose the Shame Already, something like that.
Right.
But really the point of it was to say, how can we think about ADHD with our kids in a way that's supportive, without shaming, while still recognizing that it's tough. Things like making sure that you have time for self-care and helping people understand their behavior is different than who they are as people, right? So when something frustrating happens, there's a huge difference between saying, what just happened was not okay versus you are not okay, right? The way that we phrase those things. So check out that article and see if that's helpful at all. Also, I think, if there's anything we've learned about parenting, it's that we show, don't tell is the most effective thing. So if you can call out moments when it feels like your son is making positive strides with his ADHD, when it feels like it's a positive thing, point that out. Wow, I can't believe how well you were able to focus on writing and talking to me at the same time. That's a superpower. And when things don't go right, saying, I bet in this moment it was really hard for you to do X. I can imagine it's because your brain is jumping all around. Is that what it felt like? Just infusing empathy and also pride, I think can go a really long way. And at the risk of promoting myself a bit, check out the TEDx talk too, maybe show it to him, because I think that some people have just never even been exposed to the idea that it's not only a negative force in life, and sometimes just being introduced to that thought can really change things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, somebody asks, I think that ADHDers find it hard to ask for help, but when I do find the courage to ask, whether it be a professor at school or a coworker, it really helps and keeps me from staying stuck. What can I say to myself or to be brash enough to actually ask for help? And why are ADHDers so reluctant to ask for assistance?
Wow, what an interesting idea. I don't think I've ever thought about that. So I can't necessarily answer that for sure. I haven't done the field research for it, but my hypothesis about it would be that people learn to ask for help when they have been met with help in the past. And if you've gone through your life being told that you need to do things a different way versus being offered assistance to do them your way, then I can imagine it's not going to feel very useful to ask for help. They've also done some studies that have correlated ADHD with higher levels than average of intelligence, and I think that smart people can sometimes be reluctant to help because they feel they should be able to do it all on their own. So I think the best advice I could give is keep reminding yourself that asking for help is not a weakness, that asking for help does not mean that there's something wrong with you, right? Sometimes we need assistance for something that we wouldn't even necessarily want to change about ourselves. We just need support with it. And, keep embodying that in yourself. Like I said, I think the best thing we can do to change our relationships is to change our relationship with ourselves, because people pick up in all kinds of unconscious ways the way you think that you should be treated. And if people believe that that you're worthy of help and assistance and that it doesn't necessarily say a thing about anything negative about you, then people hopefully will be more open to offering that assistance without judgment.
Right. Someone wants to know how they can break the "I'm a loser" script that tends to run through their heads in the exact moment that it's occurring versus working in therapy. Is there anything that you can do, any tricks that perhaps the people you interviewed had for this? I guess it's at the moment, I'm feeling like a loser. How can I lose that feeling and turn it around to something more productive versus working, intensely in therapy and developing strategies? And is there...
Okay, well, yeah, I've got an answer for this. So in my TEDx talk, I talk about this, so my apologies for repeating myself, but there's a quote I love that says, "It is better to be a sinner in a world ruled by God than to live in a world ruled by the devil." And what the quote is really saying is that it feels safer to be the problem than to live in a world where there are problems we can do nothing about. So I think sometimes we, as people with ADHD, tell ourselves we're a loser because it almost feels better somehow than just thinking people are not willing to accept me the way I am, even if it's perfectly good. So sometimes when I have a negative thought, I'll think, oh, my poor small inner child in there, just doing her best to try to protect herself in this really big, tough world, is doing whatever she can to take the control back as much as she can. Poor her. I'm going to give her a hug, and I'm going to give myself a little slack for doing my best, for trying whatever I can to keep myself safe. And I'm going to remember that now I'm not a little girl anymore, and I do have a little more control than I did back then, and I can change the way. And in fact, I'm not actually a loser. I'm doing everything I can with the resources I have. Sometimes a little self-love and empathy goes a long way.
Right. You had mentioned meditation and yoga helping with ADHD symptoms. Do you want to talk about that a little more, about exactly how those two approaches or therapies work in helping symptoms or managing symptoms? You had mentioned it helped you a great deal. So I was wondering if you might shed some more light on that.
Sure. So I'm definitely not an expert in the mechanisms of it, so I would refer people to looking up research on that. But one of the studies I did look at for my dissertation was a program that it was for children with, and it had both the child and the parent, whichever parent was able, join a yoga class together. And they showed huge improvements because not only was the child learning how to sit with thoughts, how to deal with the discomfort, right? Because yoga puts you in uncomfortable positions and then teaches you to examine what comes up when you're uncomfortable. So, a lot of ADHD is the fidgeting, et cetera, is because we're uncomfortable. It's because we're, understimulated and bored. And so we're doing something to try to deal with it. So if we can get a little better at being uncomfortable, then we're going to get a little bit better at not, seeking to immediately change that. And then because the parent was in the yoga class too, the parent was also in touch with the feelings that come up for them around what it's like to have a child who has a typical way of learning and taking in information and learning more patience themselves as the parent. So I thought that this was really interesting and something that could be great for parents of kids with ADHD. And then meditation is literally about teaching you what to do with your thoughts as they come up. And, I've talked about how I really wish there was some kind of special program for meditation specifically for people with ADHD, because I think it's a lot tougher to sit with 50 million thoughts than it is with the few that can come up. And, I've heard ADHD described as a million Post-its, and you don't know which one you're supposed to pay attention to at any one time. So meditation can kind of train that. I think it can be really helpful. And then exercise, increases endorphins and adrenaline, and, those things feel an awful lot like a stimulant in your body. So when you're pumped up and excited, you're not going to be feeling as sort of uncomfortable and in need of something to get your mind up to the level where everyone else's is.
Several people were intrigued with the idea of the dopamine increase, but they're wondering, what have you discovered, at least in the interviews, from the people? How did they increase their dopamine levels? Any tricks or strategies here?
Yeah. I've talked about this before, but one of my interviewees bought himself a treadmill desk, and he does all of his work while walking on a treadmill because not only does the exercise feel good, but it's just doing something with his legs. It's essentially like a fidget machine, right? It allows you to always be moving. So that was really helpful. Some people just always have TV on in the background. I found that whatever thing that you add to your task so that there's more stuff going on needs to be a little less interesting than the task itself, right? Because if you put on something you really want to do, then the task is just going to serve to help you focus on the thing you want to do. So one of my interviewees watches TV, but she only ever puts on reruns of shows she's already seen, so she's not actually invested in seeing the show. It's just the noise and movement in the background increases the dopamine a little bit. I also think that what I was talking about, having these little boosts, can be really helpful. So what makes you happy? What increases your dopamine? Is it food? Is it, beautiful pictures? Is it like organizing all of your desktop into color-coordinated folders? Whatever it is that, kind of gets you off, set that up to be able to do that in little chunks to increase your stimulation as you're doing the things that aren't as exciting.
And also, people with comorbid diagnoses, you mentioned the 3 layers. I would imagine having anxiety or depression along with your ADHD might be a more arduous process, basically, of achieving those 3 layers. I mean, do you have any suggestions for people who might have comorbid conditions? I know you've laid out the plan for just ADHD diagnoses, but
well, things are comorbid for more than one reason, right? So sometimes ADHD and depression are comorbid because of the way the brain works, and even if one didn't exist, the other would, and the person is just dealing with both. And sometimes comorbid disorders happen in a causation way, where dealing with the ADHD causes the depression, or being depressed makes it feel harder to focus, etc. So I think the two, are going to be approached a little differently, because if the reason you're anxious and depressed is all of the things I've talked about within your ADHD, then it might be that tackling the ADHD helps them. If not, then, that's something, of course, I couldn't speak to as much, but I do believe that the psychodynamic and psychoanalytic therapy can, if not help the depression and anxiety, then at least put you in contact with someone who is an expert on those things and can make sure that you have the resources that you need, can connect you with a psychiatrist if medication is necessary, can just be keeping an eye on you and making sure that you have the resources at your disposal to get through it. So, I have seen it's really common to have all three of those things at the same time, and I think therapy can make a big difference.
Right. Well, I think we've just about run out of time, Emily, and I want to thank you again. It was terrific, inspiring and empowering. I'm sure we're all going to wind up liking ourselves a little more as a result of this.
Thank you.
So you did a wonderful job of putting this stuff in perspective, and I know I've learned a lot. So thank you again.
Thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
And have a good day.
For more Attitude podcasts and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.
The first taste of rare bourbon you finally got your hands on. That's nice. At Caskers.com, we make this experience easy. Caskers is a one-stop spirit curator with an impressive selection of exclusive, sought-after, rare, and household names in the realm of premium spirits and champagne. Discover the top flavors of the year now by going to Caskers.com and using code WELCOME10 for $10 off your first purchase. Get $10 off your first purchase with code WELCOME10 at Caskers.com.